He came home to divorce papers on the kitchen table, but the silence that broke him was not from his wife leaving. It was the empty place where his German shepherd, Bracken, used to sleep. Weeks later, in the falling snow, that lost dog returned, wounded, thin, and carrying a secret path in his memory. Bracken did not lead Graham to revenge, or treasure, or a hidden villain. He led him to an old house where forgotten people had once survived winter together. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Bend, Oregon looked almost too clean beneath the morning snow. The roofs of the wooden houses wore soft white caps. Pine branches bowed under fresh powder. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray ribbons, vanishing into a pale winter sky that seemed untouched by anything ugly. The road leading to Graham Hollis's old home had been plowed once before dawn, leaving 2 dark tracks through the whiteness, like scars under gauze. Graham drove slowly. His dark pickup rolled past mailboxes buried halfway in snow, past fences glittering with frost, past the small bend in the road where Bracken used to leap against the passenger window whenever he knew they were close to home. Graham had always laughed at that, not loudly. He was not a loud man anymore. But Bracken could pull a laugh out of him the way a stubborn root pulled water from frozen ground. This morning, the passenger seat was empty. Graham kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the gearshift. His knuckles were broad, scarred in small places, the hands of a man who had spent more years fixing broken things than admitting he was one of them. He was 51, tall, a little over 6 feet, with wide shoulders that made most doorways seem narrower than they were. His dark brown hair had gone silver at the temples, and the short beard along his jaw was trimmed, though not carefully enough to suggest vanity. He wore an olive-drab combat shirt beneath his old winter jacket, the sleeves patterned in faded camouflage, the horizontal bands around the upper arms worn soft from years of use. It was practical clothing, not a costume. Still, even here, among snow-laden porches and wind chimes and Christmas wreaths left up too long, he looked like a man who had not fully returned from somewhere harsher. The house appeared between 2 ponderosa pines. It was smaller than memory allowed. A single-story place with cedar siding, a narrow porch, and a blue front door, Mary Ann had painted one July afternoon while Bracken had tried to steal the brush. Graham remembered that day too clearly. Mary Ann laughing, paint on her wrist, Bracken with one blue streak across his muzzle like some ridiculous warrior from a children's parade. The memory struck him with such quiet force that he eased off the gas. For months he had told himself this return would be difficult but repairable. He had been away too long, first for contract work he had hated less than he expected, then for a recovery program he had not admitted he needed until his hands began shaking in a grocery store aisle. He and Mary Ann had not spoken much lately. When they did, her voice sounded far away, like it came through weather. "I can't keep doing this, Graham," she had said once. He had answered with silence, which in his mind meant he was absorbing her pain. In hers, he now understood, it must have felt like speaking into a locked room. Still, he had believed in the old foolish magic of coming home. Fix the loose fence, patch the gutter, light the stove. Put his hand on Mary Ann's shoulder. Let Bracken press his heavy head against Graham's knee. Let the house remember them back into place. He parked beside the porch. For a moment, he did not move. He listened. No barking, no claws scrambling across the wooden floor, no heavy body slamming against the other side of the door because Bracken had never learned dignity when joy was available. Graham swallowed once and stepped out into the cold. Snow crunched under his boots. The air smelled of pine sap, chimney smoke, and distant road salt. He climbed the porch steps slowly, his eyes going at once to the left corner beneath the window. The dog bed was gone. Not moved, not folded. Gone. The place where it had always sat was clean except for a faint rectangle in the dust and weathering, a ghost shape on the porch boards. Graham stared at it for a long time. His breath left him in a slow white cloud. "Brack?" he called. The house did not answer. He unlocked the front door. Inside, the silence had weight. The living room looked orderly, in the way a room looks after someone has removed the evidence of a shared life, but left the furniture because furniture cannot be accused of anything. The couch was still there, the lamp with the crooked shade, the framed photograph from Crater Lake still hung near the hallway, though it sat slightly crooked on its nail. Graham noticed details automatically. He always had. A crooked frame, a fresh scrape near the baseboard, the absence of dog hair on the rug. That last detail hurt more than it should have. Bracken's water bowl was not by the kitchen threshold. His leash was not on the hook near the back door. The old towel he slept on during thunderstorms was not beside the stove. Graham walked into the kitchen, and that was where he found the papers. They sat in the center of the table, squared neatly, held down by a small ceramic mug Marianne used to keep pens in. The top page bore his name in black legal type: Graham Hollis, Marianne Hollis, petition for dissolution of marriage. He stood over it without touching it. There were moments in combat when the world narrowed to a single object: a wire in the dust, a flash at a rooftop, a door not quite closed. His body knew what to do then: freeze, read, breathe, decide. But this was only paper, white paper on a wooden table, no blast, no enemy, no command. And still something inside him braced for impact. Beside the documents was an envelope with his name written in Marianne's hand. He recognized the slight leftward slant, the pressure she put on the first letter when she was tired. He opened it carefully, because even now, absurdly, he did not want to tear anything that belonged to her. The letter was short. She did not accuse him of cruelty. That might have been easier. She wrote that she had loved him through deployments, through hospital rooms, through nights when he woke with his fists clenched and his eyes fixed on a place she could not see. She wrote that for years she had tried to build a home around his silences, but the silences had grown walls. She wrote that she no longer knew how to be a wife to a man whose body sat across from her while his soul kept listening for helicopters. At the bottom, after several crossed-out lines, she had written, "I am sorry. I am tired. I do not know how to keep losing you while you are still alive." Graham lowered the paper. The kitchen clock ticked above the sink. Snow light filled the room. Somewhere in the wall, the old furnace clicked and failed to start on the first try, just as it always had. He should have felt anger, some clean, useful thing. Anger had handles. You could grip it. You could carry it. But what came first was embarrassment, a strange, bone-deep shame, because he had known, not the papers, not the exact shape of this morning. But he had known Marianne was leaving in slow pieces. He had watched her stop asking certain questions. He had noticed the way she no longer reached for his hand when a car backfired in town. He had heard the exhaustion beneath her voice during their last calls and called it stress, called it winter, called it anything but the truth. Graham set the letter down. Then he turned away from the table and searched the house. Not for Marianne, for Bracken. He opened the laundry room. Empty. The mud room. Empty. The small back porch where Bracken liked to sleep during rainstorms. Empty. In the bedroom, Graham found the closet half cleared. Marianne's side of the dresser was bare except for a single button and a faint oval in the dust where a jewelry dish had sat. His own clothes remained folded in drawers, untouched, as if she had refused to make his choices for him. He returned to the kitchen only when there were no more doors to open. That was when he saw the mark on the back door, 4 long scratches low in the paint, Bracken's height. Graham crouched slowly. The scratches were not old. The wood beneath them was pale and raw, exposed where claws had torn through the blue-gray paint. He reached out and touched one groove with 2 fingers. A ridiculous thought came to him then. Bracken had wanted back in. It struck harder than the papers. The divorce was human. Humans failed with language and fear and pride. But Bracken had no such machinery. Bracken had only loyalty, hunger, weather, memory. If he had scratched this door, he had believed someone would open it. Graham stayed crouched there until his knees began to ache. A sound came from outside. Not barking, not claws. A shovel scraping snow. Graham stood and opened the front door. Across the narrow fence line, June Pritchard was clearing her walkway with the slow irritation of a woman who considered winter a personal insult. She was in her late 70s, small but upright, wrapped in a quilted purple coat, with white hair tucked beneath a red knit hat. June had lived next door since before Graham and Mary Ann bought the house. She had seen Bracken as a puppy. She had once accused him of stealing a roast from her porch, then fed him half of it because a thief with that face has prospects. She stopped shoveling when she saw Graham. "Oh," she said softly, "you're back." There were many things inside that word. Graham stepped down from the porch. "Where is he, June?" Her gloved hands tightened on the shovel handle. The answer was already in her face. "Graham!" "Where is Bracken?" June looked toward the empty corner of the porch, and her mouth trembled with the effort of choosing the least cruel words. "There were fireworks," she said. "Not official ones. Some fools out past the East Ridge, middle of the night, loud as cannons." She paused, then corrected herself quietly. "I'm sorry. Loud." Graham said nothing. Bracken started howling. I heard him from here. Scratching, too. Mary Ann came out once. She looked... June swallowed. She looked worn down to thread. I went over the next morning. "What happened?" "She told me she opened the door, said she thought he needed to run it off. Said he'd done that before and come back." June's voice grew smaller. "But he didn't." The cold seemed to enter Graham through the soles of his boots. "She looked?" he asked. "The first day, she drove around, put up 2 notices at the market and the vet clinic." June lowered her eyes. Then she stopped. Graham turned his head toward the street, toward the white curve of road disappearing into pines. June took 1 step closer. "She wasn't cruel, Graham." He almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because grief sometimes knocked on the wrong door and came in wearing humor's coat. "No," he said, "just tired." June's face folded. "She was ashamed," the old woman whispered. "I think she was more afraid to tell you than anything." Graham looked back at the porch, at the clean rectangle where the dog bed had been. At the scratches in the back door he could still feel under his fingertips. For years, men had trusted him to make decisions in places where hesitation killed. He had been praised for calm, admired for control. Decorated once for bringing everyone home except the part of himself that knew how to stay there. And while he was away becoming someone the world kept calling strong, his wife had been alone in a house with a frightened dog and a war that still lived in the walls. "I need his things," Graham said. June nodded, though he had not asked her anything. Back inside, he found a cardboard box in the pantry. Mary Ann had packed Bracken's remaining items there, but had not thrown them away. That mercy almost undid him. A cracked rubber ball, an old brush clogged with golden black fur. A metal tag from a collar Bracken had outgrown years ago, and at the bottom, folded carefully, the gray wool towel Bracken used to sleep on when the wind rattled the windows. Graham lifted it with both hands. For 1 moment he pressed the towel against his face. It smelled faintly of dust, cedar, and something so unmistakably Bracken that his chest tightened until he could barely breathe. By sundown, Graham had made his choice. He did not sleep in the old house. He could not remain beneath that roof with the divorce papers on the kitchen table and Bracken's scratches in the door. The house had become a museum of things he had failed to notice while they were still alive. He packed 2 duffel bags, the box of Bracken's things, and the framed photograph from Crater Lake. He left the divorce papers where they were, not because he refused them, but because he was not ready to touch them again. June watched from her porch as he loaded the truck. "You have somewhere to go?" she asked. "A cabin," Graham said, "out by the west edge, near Riddick's repair yard." June nodded. "Cal Riddick still talks too much." "That'll be a change." The old woman gave him a sad little smile. "You'll look for him?" Graham closed the tailgate. "I'll find him." It was not confidence, not yet. It was a vow built from the only materials he had left: guilt, love, and a stubbornness old enough to have roots. The cabin he rented stood at the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the pines gathered close. It was small, with a rusted stove, a sagging porch, and windows that rattled when the wind came down from the mountains. Beyond it, the repair yard sat under floodlights, rows of snowmobiles and generator casings half buried in white. The owner, Cal Riddick, had left the key under a coffee can and a note that read, "Furnace works if you swear at it first." For the first time that day, Graham almost smiled. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, cold ash, and mousetraps. Graham set Bracken's box beside the door. He lit the stove after 2 failed attempts and 1 quiet curse that would have satisfied Cal. Heat slowly filled the room, thin at first, then steady. Only then did Graham sit at the rough wooden table. He opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keys. For a long moment, he could not choose the picture. There were too many. Bracken asleep with his head on Graham's boot. Bracken standing chest-deep in summer grass. Bracken staring solemnly into the camera with one ear slightly cocked as though judging the photographer's character. Graham chose the clearest one, a large German shepherd, black and gold, amber eyes steady, chest marked by a small pale arrow of fur. He typed slowly. "Missing German shepherd. Bracken male, 8 years old. Black and tan. Torn left ear. Scar near right shoulder. Last seen near East Bend after fireworks. Friendly, but cautious. Please do not chase. Call Graham Hollis." He stared at the page. Then he added one more line. "He is family." The printer on the counter coughed, clicked, and began to feed paper through with the exhausted dignity of an old mule. The first poster emerged crooked. Graham corrected the margins and printed another. Then another. Outside the cabin window, snow fell through the yellow porch light. Inside, beside the stove, Bracken's folded towel rested on the floor where a dog bed should have been. Graham looked at it until the letters on the posters blurred. Winter was no longer scenery. It was a question. And somewhere beyond the lit windows, beyond the quiet streets and the sleeping houses, Graham imagined Bracken moving through the snow alone, carrying no map except memory, no shelter except whatever mercy the world had left. Graham reached for the next sheet of paper. He would cover the town by morning. By the 3rd morning in the cabin, Graham Hollis had learned that old wood spoke differently from old houses. His former home had gone quiet like a person refusing to answer. The cabin complained about everything. The floorboards groaned when he crossed the room. The stove clicked and muttered before deciding whether to give heat. The kitchen window rattled whenever the wind came down from the Cascades and pressed its cold hands against the glass. Even the pipes seemed to clear their throats before delivering water. Graham did not mind. A noisy place was easier than a silent one. He woke before dawn each day, not because he wanted to, but because his body had never fully learned that war did not begin at sunrise anymore. He made coffee strong enough to make lesser men reconsider their lives, then sat at the rough wooden table and checked the stack of missing posters beside his laptop. Bracken stared up from every page. Black and gold coat, steady amber eyes, the torn left ear, the pale arrow of fur at his chest, a face too serious for a dog who had once chased snowflakes, like they had insulted his family. Graham had printed 60 posters the first night. By the end of the week, he would print 200 more. At 7 each morning, he drove to Riddick's Winter Repair, a long metal building at the edge of Bend, where snowmobiles, generators, plows, and heaters came to die loudly before Cal Riddick resurrected them with profanity. Cal was a square-built man in his late 50s with a red beard going white at the chin, eyebrows like frostbitten caterpillars, and a voice that could scare loose bolts back into place. He wore insulated coveralls even indoors and kept a mug of coffee on every flat surface, as if preparing for siege. On Graham's first day, Cal looked him over and said, "You got the face of a wrench that hasn't slept since 2009. Graham had paused, unsure whether that required an answer. Cal pointed toward a broken generator. "Good. Means you'll fit in." That was the closest thing to a welcome speech. The work suited Graham better than people might have expected. Machines were honest in their failure. A cracked belt did not pretend it was fine. A clogged fuel line did not say, "Nothing's wrong," while poisoning the whole system from the inside. You opened the casing, found the fault, replaced what could be replaced, cleaned what could be cleaned, and learned to accept what was too damaged to restore. By noon each day, Graham smelled of cold metal, oil, and burnt dust. By evening, his hands ached in a way that felt almost merciful. Then the second shift began. He carried a roll of tape in one pocket, thumbtacks in another, and a folder of Bracken's posters beneath his arm. Bend in winter was beautiful enough to make grief feel rude. The streets glowed under strings of warm lights. Coffee shops breathed cinnamon and roasted beans into the cold. Couples in wool coats walked slowly past shop windows. Older men in fleece vests discussed ski conditions as if the fate of nations depended on powder depth. Everywhere Graham went, life appeared to be continuing without permission. He taped Bracken's face to bulletin boards beside guitar lessons, church suppers, used snow tires, pottery classes, and one handwritten notice offering emotionally complicated sourdough starter. That one nearly made him smile. Nearly. At the gas station, the cashier let him put a poster by the register, then told him about a black dog he had seen 2 counties west. At the laundromat, a woman folding towels said she would pray for him, then asked whether there was a reward. At the post office, an older man studied the poster for a long time and said, "Pretty dog. Shame about winter." Graham thanked him anyway. He learned to keep his face still when people tried to comfort him by lowering expectations. He learned that pity had a sound, softer than kindness, thinner than help. He learned that hope became harder to carry when everyone around him treated it like a fragile antique he ought to stop touching. Still, he kept posting. At night, the posters became markers on a private map of refusal. One at the trailhead by Shevlin Park, one outside the feed store, one near the small white church on the hill, 3 along the public board at the grocery entrance because the wind kept stealing them, and Graham kept replacing them with the patience of a man rebuilding a bridge no one else believed would hold. On the 5th evening, snow began falling before sunset. Fine at first, like sifted flour. Then thicker, steadier, turning headlights soft and making the sidewalks shine under the lamps. Graham had just finished taping a poster to the window of a closed hardware store when his phone rang. For one impossible second, his heart rose so quickly it hurt. Unknown number. He answered before the second ring. "Hollis?" A young man's voice said, "I think I saw your dog." Graham stood very still beneath the awning. "Where?" "Out by the old quarry road. Big shepherd. Looked rough." "When?" "Yesterday, maybe 2 days ago." "Did you get close?" "Nah, it was dark. Could have been a coyote, I guess." "A coyote?" Graham closed his eyes. The young man kept talking, offering landmarks that did not line up, details that shifted when questioned. Graham listened until there was nothing useful left. Then he thanked him and hung up. For a moment, he remained under the hardware store awning while snow tapped softly against the metal above his head. He wanted to throw the phone into the street. Instead, he folded one ruined poster in half, then in half again, and put it carefully in his pocket. That was the new shape of his anger, not fire, but restraint. The next morning, Cal found him replacing a cracked recoil starter on a snowmobile. "You look worse than yesterday," Cal said. "Appreciate the update." "Any time. I provide emotional support through accurate insults." Graham tightened a bolt. "Had a false sighting." Cal grunted. For once, he did not make a joke immediately. He leaned against the workbench, arms folded over his coveralls. "Lost a hound once," Cal said. "Years back. Dumb animal chased a deer like he had a legal claim on it. Gone 4 days." "What happened?" "Came home smelling like swamp and bad decisions." Cal scratched his beard. "My wife cried. I told the dog he was an idiot. Dog agreed with both of us." Graham looked down at the engine. Cal's voice softened just enough to almost disappear beneath the heater fan. Dogs come back from strange places. It was not a promise. Graham respected him for that. Later that afternoon, while the sky brightened in that hard winter way after snowfall, Graham drove across town to Juniper Paw Clinic. He had already left a poster there, but the first version had been printed too dark. Bracken's torn ear was not clear enough. Tessa Monroe had told him so over the phone with the bluntness of someone who spent her days telling people their pets were overweight, infected, anxious, spoiled, or all four. The clinic sat between a bakery and a shop that sold handmade candles with names like Snowfall Mercy and Mountain Silence. A bell chimed when Graham entered. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic, wet fur, and lavender someone had deployed bravely, but not successfully. A terrier in a red sweater trembled on an old man's lap. A gray cat stared at Graham from a carrier with open hatred. Somewhere behind a door, a dog barked twice, then apparently reconsidered its argument. Tessa came out carrying a clipboard under one arm and a half-eaten granola bar in her mouth. She removed it and said, "You're Hollis." "Graham," he said. "Right. Bracken's person." The phrase caught him off guard. Not owner. Person. Tessa was in her early 40s, compact and quick-moving, with dark blonde hair twisted into a messy knot and a pen tucked behind one ear. Her scrub top was teal, her white coat was unbuttoned, and one sleeve bore a smear of something Graham decided not to identify. Her brown eyes were alert in a way that made excuses feel unsafe. She took the poster from him and studied it. "This one's better," she said, "but add the chest marking." "The white patch?" "It's shaped like an arrow. People remember shapes better than descriptions." She tapped the photo. "Also mention he tilts his head at bells." Graham looked at her. Tessa glanced up. "He did it every time the door chime rang here, like he was judging our customer service." Despite himself, Graham felt something loosen in his chest. He was probably right. He usually was. Tessa handed the poster back, then leaned against the counter. "I remember him. Big shepherd, old soul, terrible opinions about thermometers." "He hated those." "They all do. Bracken just made it personal." For the first time since returning to Bend, someone spoke about Bracken as if he were not already a memory. Graham looked away toward a shelf of leashes. Tessa saw more than he wanted her to, but she did not soften her voice, which made it bearable. "You said on the phone he's been gone a few weeks?" "More than that now. Marianne said he ran after fireworks. East Side." Tessa's expression shifted slightly at Marianne's name. Not judgment. Recognition, maybe. "He ever run before?" Graham started to answer no, then stopped. The truth was, he did not know what Bracken had done on nights Graham was gone. He knew the version of the dog that slept beside him, walked with him, steadied him. But Bracken had also lived inside a marriage Graham had not fully seen. "I thought he didn't," he said. Tessa nodded once, as if that answer told her enough. She walked behind the counter, opened an old file drawer, and began flipping through folders. Graham watched her hands move. "What are you looking for?" "Something I half remember." She pulled a folder, frowned, put it back, pulled another. "Here." She opened a file and turned it toward him. The date was from nearly 2 years earlier. Patient, Bracken Hollis. Minor paw laceration, no infection. Brought in by Silas Mercer. Graham stared at the name. "I don't know him," he said. "Older man, white beard, Army jacket, though I don't know if he was Army. He had that general veteran look, like he disapproved of chairs that weren't made of wood." Graham read the note again. Why did he have Bracken? Said he found him near Millstone Road during a storm. Dog had a cut pad. Bracken still had an address tag then, so Silas brought him in first, got the paw cleaned, then said he'd take him home. Tessa paused. "I assumed you knew." Graham heard Marianne's letter again. "I am sorry. I am tired." "No," he said, "I didn't." The clinic seemed to grow smaller around him. Tessa closed the file slowly. "This doesn't mean anything bad," she said. "Dogs remember safe places. Sometimes they go to them when they're scared." "Millstone Road," Graham repeated. "Old part of town. Not much up there now. A few empty houses, some private land." She studied him. "Don't go chasing every old note tonight. You'll burn yourself out." Graham almost told her he had already burned down long ago and was only walking around in the outline. Instead, he asked, "Can I have a copy?" Tessa made one without comment. When she handed it to him, her tone became practical again. "Update the poster, add the chest marking, torn left ear, shoulder scar, bell habit, and write 'Do not chase' in bigger letters. If he's scared, people running at him will make it worse." Graham folded the copy and placed it inside his jacket. "Thank you." Tessa picked up her granola bar again. "Don't thank me until the printer behaves." At the door, he turned back. Was Bracken all right when Silas brought him in? Tessa's face changed just a little. "He was calm," she said, "like he trusted the man." The words followed Graham into the snow. That evening, he did not go straight to Millstone Road. The decision cost him. Every old instinct wanted movement, a name, a location, a possible connection. Those were enough to launch a search grid in another life. But this was not another life, and Bracken was not a target on a map. He was tired, frightened, maybe hungry, maybe hurt. A wrong move could push him farther. So Graham did something harder than action. He waited. He updated every poster. He enlarged the words, "Do not chase." He added the pale arrow on Bracken's chest, the torn left ear, the shoulder scar, the way bells drew his attention. He printed until the cabin smelled of warm paper and toner. Then he went out again. The town had grown brighter after dark. Snow reflected every lamp. Store windows shone gold. People walked quickly with their collars up, laughing as they slipped on icy patches. A man outside the bakery held a box of pastries under his coat like a rescued animal. Somewhere, church bells rang 6 times over the rooftops. Graham stopped beneath the sound. He imagined Bracken hearing bells somewhere in the cold, lifting his head, one torn ear catching the air. "Hold on," Graham murmured. He put a poster on the bakery board, one at the feed store, one on the community post outside the library, one at the entrance to the road that led toward the winter trail camps. The last poster in his folder went to the white church on the hill. By then, the snow was coming harder, thick enough to blur the street below. The church windows glowed dimly, amber behind frosted glass. Graham stood on the steps, carefully smoothing tape over the corners of Bracken's face. The wind tried to lift the paper. He pressed it down with the flat of his palm until it held. He stepped back. Bracken looked out from the poster with his solemn amber eyes, the pale arrow on his chest now clear. Graham touched 2 fingers to the bottom edge of the page. Not a salute, not quite a prayer, just contact. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "Help me out here." The church bell shifted in the tower above him, moved by the wind. A low sound came from behind him. Graham froze. It was not loud, not strong. A rough bark scraped thin by cold and distance. Every muscle in his body locked before his mind could catch up. The town noise fell away. The passing cars, the wind, the bell. The whole bright winter world narrowed to the dark line of trees beyond the churchyard. Graham turned slowly. At the edge of the street, where the snow gathered blue beneath the pines, something moved. Then came the sound again. A bark he knew. Broken, but unmistakable. Graham's breath stopped in his chest. "Bracken?" The shape in the snow did not come closer, but it did not run. And for the first time since Graham had come home to an empty porch, hope did not feel like a lie. It felt like a living thing, wounded and waiting in the dark. For a few seconds, Graham Hollis forgot how to breathe. The snow kept falling over the church steps, soft and white and indifferent. The poster behind him stirred at the corners beneath the tape. Somewhere down the hill, tires whispered along the road, and the town of Bend continued glowing in its warm windows, unaware that the world had just narrowed to one dark shape beneath the pines. The dog stood at the far edge of the street, thin, still, watching. Graham knew him before his mind allowed the hope to form. The black saddle across the back, the gold along the chest and legs, the torn left ear, now folded slightly under the weight of snow, the pale arrow of fur on his chest, dulled by dirt and ice, but still there, still pointing upward like a stubborn mark left by God's thumb. Bracken! The name came out broken. The German shepherd did not run to him, not at first. That hurt in a way Graham had not prepared for. In every dream, Bracken came charging through the snow, paws flying, body slamming into him with that reckless joy only dogs could afford. But the real Bracken stood motionless under the pines, ribs faintly visible beneath his winter-thick coat, one front paw held a little too carefully above the ground. His amber eyes fixed on Graham, not empty, not wild, but cautious, as though joy itself had become something that needed permission. Graham stepped down from the church walkway. A car passed between them, slow in the snow. Its headlights washed over Bracken's face, and the dog flinched back a half step. Graham stopped immediately. Every instinct in him wanted to cross the road, gather the animal into his arms, anchor him, claim him back from the cold. But Tessa's warning rose inside him with irritating clarity. Do not chase. So Graham lowered himself slowly to one knee in the snow. His jeans soaked almost at once. The cold bit through the fabric. He did not care. "Easy," he said, and made his voice small. Not command voice, not parade ground, not battlefield. Just the low, patient tone he had once used after thunderstorms when Bracken hid beside the bed and pretended not to be scared. "Easy, boy. It's me." Bracken's ears twitched. Graham removed his gloves and set them on the snow beside him. Then he held out one bare hand, palm down, fingers loose. The old signal. No pressure, no demand, just an invitation. Bracken took one step, then another. His movement was wrong. Not badly wrong, but enough that Graham felt each uneven shift in his own bones. The dog's right front paw landed lightly, as if the ground hurt him. Snow clung to the fur beneath his belly. His coat, once thick and glossy, had grown rough around the neck and shoulders. There was a narrow, worn place across his throat where something had rubbed too long. Graham saw all of it. He forced himself not to move. Bracken stopped halfway across the road. For one terrible second, Graham thought the dog might turn and vanish again, melting back into the trees like the answer to a prayer that had changed its mind. Then the church bell above them gave a small metallic shift in the wind. Bracken's head lifted. His eyes changed. Memory moved through him faster than fear. He came forward, not running, not yet. But with gathering certainty, one limping step after another until he reached Graham and pressed his nose against Graham's open hand. The touch was so light, it nearly destroyed him. Graham bowed his head. "Hey, buddy." Bracken inhaled sharply, taking in the scent of oil, snow, wool, old coffee, and the man who had been missing from his world as surely as he had been missing from Graham's. A tremor passed through the dog's body. Then he made a sound Graham had never heard from him before. Not a bark, not a whine, but something low and wounded, pulled from the deepest place an animal could keep loyalty. Graham opened his arms. Bracken came into them. The impact knocked him backward into the snow. Graham held on. His hands sank into damp fur and cold burrs and ribs that should not have been so easy to feel. Bracken pushed his head beneath Graham's chin, trembling so hard that Graham could feel it through his chest. For a while, he did not speak. There were no good words for what had been returned half-starved from the mouth of winter. He simply held the dog and let the snow cover them both. When Graham finally lifted his head, a woman standing near the church doors had one hand pressed over her mouth. An older man at the curb had stopped with his groceries in his arms. Nobody came closer. Perhaps grief had made something holy around them. Perhaps the look on Graham's face warned the world to stay back. He pulled his phone out with shaking fingers and called Tessa. She answered on the third ring. "If this is about another coyote sighting, I swear." "I found him." Silence. Then Tessa's voice changed completely. "Where are you?" "Church Hill. He's hurt." "I'll open the clinic. Bring him now. Drive slow." Bracken resisted the truck at first, not violently. He simply froze at the passenger door, head low, breath quick. Graham recognized the refusal as fear, not disobedience. The old Bracken had loved trucks. He used to leap in before the door was fully open, certain every trip might involve rivers, trails, or forbidden drive-through bacon. This Bracken stared into the cab as if it were a box that might close forever. Graham stepped back. "All right," he said softly. "No rush." He took the folded gray towel from behind the seat, Bracken's old towel, the one he had brought from the house, and placed it on the passenger floor. Bracken smelled it. Something in him softened. He climbed in slowly, his injured paw trembling on the running board. Graham shut the door as gently as if the truck were a sleeping animal. At Juniper Paw Clinic, Tessa was waiting in the pool of yellow light by the entrance, her coat pulled over scrubs and her hair twisted up with a pencil. She did not waste time greeting him. One look at Bracken and her mouth tightened. "Exam room 2. Bracken stayed close to Graham's leg as they entered, eyes scanning the lobby. The clinic after hours felt different. No barking patients, no ringing phones, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of antiseptic. Tessa moved with a calm efficiency that Graham trusted immediately. She did not crowd Bracken. She let him sniff the room, let him decide where to stand, let Graham keep one hand against his shoulder. "Good boy," she murmured, checking his paws first. "You made it a long way, didn't you?" Bracken allowed the exam, but only barely. When Tessa touched the worn place around his neck, his whole body stiffened. A low growl gathered in his chest. Graham's hand went still. Tessa withdrew at once. "Okay, not there yet." Bracken looked ashamed afterward, as though growling at help was a moral failure. "No," Graham said, bending near his ear. "You're all right. You don't owe anybody perfect manners tonight." Tessa glanced at him, then looked away quickly, pretending to adjust a tray. The examination took nearly an hour. Cracked pads, weight loss, dehydration, a shallow infection near the shoulder scar, bruising where a collar, rope, or some trapped object had rubbed too long. Nothing that told a clean story. Nothing cinematic. No single villain's signature stamped on his body. That made it worse. Tessa removed her gloves and leaned against the counter. "He's been surviving," she said. "Not held in one place the whole time, I don't think. More like passed through bad luck. Maybe got caught somewhere. Maybe someone kept him briefly, and he got loose. Maybe he found scraps, shelter, then lost them again." Graham stroked the fur between Bracken's ears. "He was alone." "Sometimes," Tessa said. "Maybe not always. He doesn't look like a dog who had no help at all." That sentence stayed with Graham. No help at all would have been simple to understand. Cruel, but simple. This was messier. Bracken had survived through fragments. A porch, a handout, an unlocked shed, a ditch out of the wind, a stranger who fed him once and forgot him by morning. Not evil, not rescue. Just the wide, gray country between the two, where most suffering lived. Tessa gave Graham antibiotics, ointment, feeding instructions, and a look stern enough to qualify as a legal document. Small meals, warm water available, no long walks, no stairs if you can help it. Check the paws twice a day. And do not let guilt turn you stupid. Graham looked up. That's medical advice? It is when men are involved. He almost smiled. Bracken leaned heavily against his leg. For the first time since the church, Graham felt the full weight of the dog's exhaustion. Not symbolic weight. Actual living weight. Bracken was standing because Graham was standing. If Graham moved too quickly, the dog followed. If Graham shifted, Bracken shifted. Loyalty had brought him back, but it had not made him whole. At the cabin, Graham laid every blanket he owned beside the stove. Bracken did not lie down at first. He circled the room once, nose low, memorizing it. He inspected the door, the windows, the stove, the corner beneath the table. He paused at the box of his old things and sniffed the cracked rubber ball, then the brush, then the folded towel. Only when Graham sat on the floor did Bracken lower himself beside him. The descent was slow and painful. Graham looked away to give him dignity. That night, Graham slept in a chair beside the stove, one hand hanging low enough for Bracken to smell if he woke. He did wake, many times. Once at midnight, once after 2, once when wind struck the side of the cabin and made the window rattle. Each time, Bracken lifted his head in alarm. Each time, Graham whispered, "Still here." By the third day, the cabin had become a small kingdom of routines, pills hidden in soft food, paw balm warmed between Graham's fingers, short trips outside under the porch light, fresh water by the stove, a towel near the door. A second bowl because Graham found he could not bear seeing only one. Cal Riddick stopped by with a bag of premium dog food, balanced on one shoulder. "Inventory error," he announced. Graham looked at the label. "This expires next year." "Long-term error." Bracken watched from the doorway, head low, but eyes alert. Cal squinted at him. "He looks like he could still judge a man's engine work." "He can." "Good. World needs standards." He left before gratitude could make things awkward. June Pritchard came the next afternoon with a knitted blanket in a paper grocery bag. She stood on the porch, peering past Graham at Bracken by the stove. "Oh," she whispered. The old woman did not ask to come in. She did not rush toward him. She only set the bag down. "I made that years ago," she said. "It's ugly, but warm, like my second husband." Graham accepted it. "Thank you, June." Her eyes grew wet, but she blamed the wind, which was polite of her. Tessa visited twice in the first week, always practical, always carrying supplies, always pretending she did not notice the way Graham had begun measuring his own breathing to Bracken's. On the 10th day, she watched Bracken walk slowly across the cabin floor and nodded. "Better?" "He's still limping." "He will, for a while, maybe always a little when it's cold." Graham absorbed that. Not everything healed back to before. Tessa must have seen the thought land. "A limp isn't failure, Graham. It's a record." Bracken, who disliked being discussed without consultation, sneezed directly on her boot. Tessa looked down. "And that is medical ingratitude." The small joke changed the room. Not dramatically. No grand thaw. But Graham felt something shift. For 10 days, fear had sat with them like an extra person by the stove. That afternoon, for the first time, the cabin contained something else, too. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of ordinary annoyance. Dog hair, mud, pills refused, a vet insulted by a sneeze, life returning in work boots. The strange behavior began after that. At first, Graham thought it was only sensitivity. The church bell from town carried farther in cold weather. When it rang at noon, Bracken lifted his head from the blanket and stared toward the window. The first time, Graham dismissed it. The second time, he noticed the dog's ears were not flattened in fear. They were forward, listening. A day later, a distant whistle from the winter tourist train drifted through the valley. Bracken rose so fast his front paw slipped. Graham caught him by the harness before he could strain himself. "Easy?" Bracken did not look at him. He stared west toward the older roads beyond town. Then came the smell. Graham had been stacking split pine near the porch when the wind shifted. Damp wood smoke rolled down from somewhere beyond the ridge, heavy with the sharp scent of wet cedar and old ash. Bracken, who had been lying in a patch of pale sunlight, stood at once. His body changed. Not panic. Recognition. He stepped off the porch, limped to the edge of the yard, and faced the road. Bracken! The dog's torn left ear twitched. Graham came beside him and followed his gaze. Beyond the pines, past the road, past the bright roofs of Bend, lay the direction of Millstone. The name returned with Tessa's file. Silas Mercer, found near Millstone Road. Bracken remained still for almost a full minute. Then he gave one quiet sound in his throat, not quite a whine. It was the sound of wanting two homes and trusting neither one completely. Graham rested his hand against Bracken's back, careful not to touch the sore place at his neck. "What happened out there?" he asked softly. Bracken leaned into him, but his eyes stayed on the road. Tessa had ordered short walks only, so Graham obeyed, mostly. By the end of the second week, Bracken could manage the plowed lane outside the cabin and back. The morning was bright enough to make the snow glitter like ground glass. Graham wore his olive combat shirt beneath a canvas jacket, boots laced tight, leash looped carefully around his wrist. Bracken walked at his side, slower than before, but steadier. For the first quarter mile, everything went well. Then the church bell rang. Far off, faint through the winter air. Bracken stopped. Graham stopped with him. The dog turned his head toward the old road. "No," Graham said gently. "Not that way." Bracken took one step. Graham tightened the leash. "Bracken, heel." The command had lived between them for years. It had crossed deserts, crowded sidewalks, hospital parking lots, midnight panic, grocery aisles, trailheads, storms. Bracken had always obeyed, not because he was broken to obedience, but because trust made the word easy. This time, he did not. He pulled. Not hard enough to drag Graham, not wildly. He pulled with solemn insistence, body angled toward the road that led west. "Bracken!" The dog looked back at him. In those amber eyes, Graham saw no defiance, no confusion, no fear. He saw memory. The leash stretched between them like a question. Graham could force him back. He was strong enough. Bracken was still weak enough. The old Graham, the one who understood safety as control, might have done it. He might have decided the dog was injured, the road was uncertain, the world had already taken enough, and love meant keeping what had returned close enough to touch. But Bracken had come back carrying something Graham did not understand. A direction, a debt. A place inside him that Graham had not put there. Slowly, Graham loosened his grip. "All right," he said. Bracken turned toward Millstone Road. He did not run. He did not lunge. He simply began walking, limping a little through the bright snow, leading Graham away from the cabin and toward whatever memory had survived the winter with him. For the first time in their life together, Graham followed. Millstone Road did not announce itself. There was no bright sign, no line of mailboxes, no neat promise that anything worth finding waited at the top. It curved away from the plowed county road like an afterthought, narrow and pale beneath packed snow, climbing through pine and juniper toward the western ridge. Bracken led slowly. He did not pull now with the sharp insistence he had shown near the cabin. That urgency had quieted into certainty. His limp was still there, light but visible, and every few minutes Graham shortened his stride to match the dog's pace. The leash hung between them, loose for the first time since Bracken had returned. Graham did not speak. The morning was bright in the clean, hard way. Winter sometimes became after a storm. Sunlight flashed over the snowfields below, turning the valley into a bowl of white glass. Bend lay behind them, tucked among trees and rooftops and chimney smoke, a town pretending it could not see its own lonely corners from this high up. Bracken could. That thought troubled Graham more than he liked. The old dog moved as if following a road inside the road. Sometimes he paused to smell a fence post nearly buried in snow. Sometimes he lifted his head toward a sound Graham could not hear. Once, near a bend where 2 deer had crossed, Bracken stopped completely and stared toward the trees, not hunting, not afraid, remembering. "You've been here before," Graham said quietly. Bracken did not look back. At the top of the rise, the road widened into a clearing, and the house appeared. It stood at the end of a half-buried drive, 2 stories of weathered timber and peeling gray paint, with a porch that sagged at one corner as though tired of holding itself up. Snow loaded the roof in uneven sheets. Several window panes were cracked. One upstairs shutter hung loose, tapping faintly whenever wind moved under it. From a distance, it looked abandoned. From closer, it did not. Graham noticed the path first. Someone had cleared a narrow walkway from the drive to the porch steps. Not well, not professionally, but recently enough that the edges were still crisp. A stack of split wood rested beneath a tarp along the side wall. Fresh boot prints crossed the porch and disappeared around the back. Bracken stopped at the bottom step. His torn left ear twitched. He placed one paw on the porch, then looked at Graham. Not asking permission exactly, inviting witness. Graham felt the small hairs rise along the back of his neck. The house had no menace. That was what made it strange. Places could carry danger in their silence, and Graham had known many that did. But this house carried something else. A waiting, a held breath. Like an old church after the congregation had gone, still warm from knees and prayers. The front door was unlocked. Graham pushed it open with 2 fingers. Cold air moved out to meet him, carrying the smell of dust, old wood, stale coffee, and faintly, unmistakably, dog food. Bracken entered first. Inside, the house was dim but not dead. The front room opened wide beneath a low ceiling crossed with dark beams. A faded braided rug lay before a fireplace blackened from old use. 6 mismatched chairs had been arranged in a circle, not stored, arranged, as if the people who used them had only stepped into another room and might return once the kettle boiled. On the central table sat several chipped mugs, a tin of tea, a jar of instant coffee gone hard at the bottom, 2 cans of dog food, and a deck of cards bound with a rubber band. Beside them rested a cloth-covered notebook. Graham stood just inside the threshold, unwilling to disturb anything. Bracken moved to the fireplace and lowered his nose to the hearthstone. His tail did not wag, but his breathing changed. Slower, deeper, the way it had begun to sound in the cabin only after the first week, when sleep had stopped feeling like a trick. Graham shut the door behind them. The room seemed to exhale. He walked to the table and touched the back of one chair. Its wood was worn smooth at the top, polished by years of hands. On the wall near the fireplace hung a small row of hooks. 2 old coats remained there, both too dusty to belong to anyone present, yet not so forgotten that they felt discarded. On the mantel, someone had lined up photographs. Graham leaned closer. Men with gray beards and tired eyes. Women in winter coats, holding paper plates, smiling reluctantly. Dogs of all sizes seated at their feet. Shepherds, mutts, a beagle with one cloudy eye, a black lab resting its head on a man's boot. No banners, no uniforms displayed for pride. Just people who looked as if they had come in from weather that was not entirely outside. Graham opened the notebook. The handwriting inside varied. Some pages held neat lines in dark ink. Others had shaky block letters, dates, names, small notes that were too plain to be sentimental and somehow more heartbreaking because of it. Hal came in during storm, Mabel coughing. Sent with cough syrup and beef stew. Ruth brought blankets again, would not take payment, called everyone stubborn fools. Owen said nothing, but stayed for coffee. A few pages later, Graham's hand stopped. Bracken came again, waited by south window until snow eased, gave him red scarf, returned him at dusk. Graham read the line twice, then a third time. The words did not accuse him. That was the terrible thing. They simply existed. Bracken had been here, more than once. He had waited by a south window while snow moved over the valley. Someone had given him a scarf. Someone had taken him home. Graham looked across the room. Bracken had gone to a window near the far wall. The glass there was old and bubbled, blurring the snowy slope beyond. He stood with his nose nearly touching it, his body still, his injured paw resting lightly on the floorboards. South window. A strange sensation moved through Graham, not quite jealousy, not quite relief. He had spent weeks imagining Bracken alone in ditches, under porches, in the indifferent white mouth of winter. Now he had proof that at least once, perhaps many times, Bracken had known warmth Graham had not provided. That should have comforted him. Instead, it humbled him. He was still standing with the notebook open when he heard the sound of the back door. Bracken turned first. Graham's body responded before thought. He closed the notebook softly, shifted his weight, and angled himself so the table stood between him and the hallway. An older woman appeared at the kitchen entrance, carrying a canvas bag of split kindling against one hip. She froze. So did Graham. The woman was small, perhaps early 60s, wrapped in a gray wool coat with a burgundy knit hat pulled low over short hair that was more silver than brown. Round glasses hung on a chain at her chest, and the skin around her eyes had the fine creases of someone who had spent a lifetime reading small print and weathering large sorrows. One gloved hand tightened on the bag. The other held a key ring heavy with old brass. Then she saw Bracken. Her face changed completely. "Oh," she whispered. Bracken stepped toward her. No alarm, no growl. He went slowly, with the solemn courtesy of a dog greeting someone from an older chapter of his life. The woman lowered the bag to the floor. Her eyes shone, but she smiled as if grief had taught her not to rush joy. "Well," she said, voice soft and dry. "Look who finally decided to stop worrying everybody." Bracken pressed his nose into her coat. Graham looked from the dog to the woman. "You know him?" "I know a version of him." She scratched carefully behind Bracken's uninjured ear. "Though this version looks like he had an argument with half the county and lost only some of them." Despite himself, Graham almost laughed. The woman looked at him then, measuring him not with suspicion, but with a librarian's precise interest. "You must be Graham Hollis." His hand tightened at his side. "And you are?" "Mara Keene." She removed one glove and offered her hand. Her grip was cool, narrow-boned, steady. I work at the public library 3 days a week and mind other people's ghosts the rest of the time." It was such an odd sentence that Graham did not know what to do with it. Mara seemed used to that. "This was Silas Mercer's place," she said, "or it was supposed to be. Now it belongs to paperwork, taxes, and distant relatives, which is a colder kingdom altogether." Graham glanced toward the notebook. "Tessa Monroe told me Silas found Bracken once." "More than once?" The answer landed quietly. Mara removed her hat, shook snow from it, and moved toward the kitchen as if Graham's presence had become acceptable because Bracken had approved him. "There's still a kettle if the mice haven't unionized." "I don't want to intrude." "You already have." She looked back and the corner of her mouth lifted. But so did most people who needed this place. That was rather the point. She filled an old kettle from a jug of water near the sink, then set it on a small camping burner. Graham noticed she knew exactly where everything was. Matches in the blue cup, tea tin on the second shelf, spare dog biscuits in a metal can under the counter. Not a trespasser. A caretaker. Bracken settled near the kitchen doorway, watching both of them. "This house looks abandoned from the road," Graham said. "It helps." Mara lit the burner. "People leave ugly things alone. Beautiful things attract buyers." "Are you supposed to be here?" "No." She said it without apology. Graham waited. Mara sighed. "Silas died 14 months ago. Heart, not drama. He was stacking wood because of course he was. A man like that could have been offered a quiet death in bed and would have called it impractical." The kettle began to tick softly over the flame. "My husband came here before he died," Mara continued. "Not for therapy. He would have rather swallowed a pine cone. He came because Silas made coffee and didn't ask questions until the second cup." Graham looked toward the circle of chairs. What was this place? Mara carried 2 mugs into the front room and sat in one of the worn chairs. She nodded toward another. Graham remained standing for a moment, then sat across from her. Bracken moved between them and lay down with his head on his paws. "It was never official," Mara said. "Silas hated official things. Forms gave him hives. But he knew people, veterans mostly, widows, men living out of trucks, women with dogs they fed better than themselves. Folks who could get through summer well enough, then started to disappear once the snow came." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "He opened the house on bad weather days at first. Coffee, soup, dry socks, dog food, then Saturdays, then whenever somebody knew where the key was hidden." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mara looked at him gently, which was worse than accusation. "Were you asking?" The room went very still. Graham looked down at his hands. There it was, laid between them without cruelty. The question he had earned. He had been away, yes, working, recovering, surviving. But he had also been absent in ways no travel schedule could explain. He had known his own pain so intimately that it had become a kingdom, and kingdoms did not notice small roads beyond their walls. Bracken sighed in his sleep. Mara did not press harder. That mercy gave the words more weight. "He came here when your house grew loud," she said after a while. "Not often at first. Dogs do that. Find the person with soup. Find the porch without shouting. Silas took him back the first time because of the tag. After that, Bracken seemed to know the way. Silas worried, but he also understood." "Understood what?" "That sometimes a creature runs because it has nowhere else to put its fear." Graham swallowed. Mara rose and walked to the mantel. She lifted a photograph from the row and handed it to him. In it, Silas Mercer stood on the front porch in snowfall, tall even in old age, with a white beard, a battered army jacket, and a grin that seemed reluctant but real. Beside him stood Bracken, healthier then, proud and alert, a red scarf tied loosely around his neck. Graham touched the edge of the picture. He had never seen the scarf. "Silas gave him that," Mara said. Said a dog with that much dignity ought to own one ridiculous article of clothing. Bracken opened one eye as if insulted from the floor. Mara smiled. He disliked it at first. Then he refused to leave without it. Graham stared at the photograph. The pain that moved through him now was different from the pain of losing Bracken. It had less panic in it, more shame perhaps, more wonder. He had thought love meant being the one Bracken returned to. But here was evidence that love had also been other hands, other fires, another man's scarf tied clumsily against the cold. He was not the only one who had kept Bracken alive, and Bracken, in his quiet animal wisdom, had remembered all of them. Mara took the picture back carefully. After Silas died, I kept coming when I could. Left food, cleared the path, put out coffee no one drank. Foolish, maybe. No, Graham said. The word came faster than he expected. Mara looked at him. Graham looked around the room, the chairs, the mugs, the notebook, the circle waiting for bodies that had once trusted it enough to sit down. Not foolish? Something in Mara's face softened and retreated at the same time, like a window briefly lit from within. Outside, wind pushed snow from the porch roof in a soft slide. Bracken rose. He walked to the south window again and stood there, looking out over the valley. Graham joined him. From that window the town seemed far below, bright and harmless, all roofs and smoke and winter glitter. But between the house and Bend lay old roads, scattered cabins, parked trailers, lonely mailboxes, and places where a person could vanish slowly without ever making the news. On the windowsill, scratched faintly into the wood, were names, not carved deep, just pressed in with a knife tip or nail. Hal plus Mabel Ruth, Owen S. M. Bracken. Graham ran his thumb over the last one. Bracken leaned against his leg. Not hard. Enough. Mara stood behind them and said, Silas used to say nobody should have to explain why they came in from the storm. The storm was reason enough. Graham did not answer. He could not, because for weeks he had believed his story was about a man losing his wife and finding his dog. That was painful, but it was small enough to hold. Now the shape of it widened. Bracken had not only survived by instinct, he had survived because a hidden web of worn-out people had once made room for him. A retired man with a red scarf, a librarian with illegal keys, a circle of chairs, a house that looked abandoned because the world often mistook quiet mercy for emptiness. Graham looked down at the dog. What were you trying to show me? Bracken kept his eyes on the snowy valley. Mara answered instead, though perhaps she did not know she was doing it. This house still remembers everyone, she said softly. That's the trouble. The rest of the town doesn't. Graham stood at the south window until the light began to fade blue across the snow. He had come following a dog. He had found a place that had been keeping watch. And somewhere inside him, beneath the guilt and relief and old military habit of wanting clear objectives, something quieter began to stir. Not a mission. Not yet. Only the first uneasy understanding that being brought home by love sometimes meant being led to a door that was not yours, and being asked whether you had the courage to open it anyway. Graham did not go to Marianne the next morning. That would have been the old rhythm. Find a fact, pursue it, force an answer out of the nearest locked door. He had lived half his adult life believing speed could save lives. But Millstone House had done something uncomfortable to him. It had placed a different kind of evidence in his hands, not blood, not tracks, not threat, but chairs, mugs, names, a red scarf in a photograph, and a dog who had found warmth Graham had not known how to give. So he waited 2 days. He told himself Bracken needed rest. That was true. The shepherd still tired quickly, and his paw ached after too much walking. But Graham knew the deeper reason. He was afraid of what Marianne might say if he asked the right question. On the third afternoon, with snow falling in small bright flakes that looked too gentle for the damage winter could do, Graham drove to the apartment complex near St. Charles Medical Center. Marianne lived on the second floor of a beige building with clean walkways, outdoor stairs, and a row of identical doors. Nothing about it looked permanent. No wreath, no muddy boots, no dog bowl, no sign that someone had chosen this place with hope. He stood outside her door for almost a minute before knocking. When Marianne opened it, she was still in her nursing scrubs, slate blue under a soft gray cardigan. Her hair, brown with a few silver strands near the temples, had been tied low and badly, as if she had done it in an elevator. She looked thinner than he remembered, or perhaps he was finally looking without the old assumption that she would always remain where he left her. Her face went pale. "Graham!" He had imagined anger in her voice, defensiveness, maybe relief. Instead, he heard fatigue so deep it seemed older than either of them. "I'm not here to fight," he said. A faint, humorless breath left her. That usually means someone came prepared to fight politely. He almost smiled. Almost. Then her eyes moved past his shoulder toward the parking lot. "Is he with you?" Graham shook his head. "He's at the cabin, resting." Marianne gripped the edge of the door. The change in her was immediate and almost frightening. Her knees seemed to lose certainty. She stepped back, one hand going to the wall. "He's alive?" "Yes." For a moment, she covered her mouth, not dramatically, not as though asking for forgiveness. It was the small, involuntary gesture of someone struck by news she had prayed for and feared in equal measure. Graham stepped inside only after she moved aside. The apartment was clean in the way hospital rooms were clean, necessary, controlled, a little lonely. A folded blanket lay over the back of the couch. A mug sat beside a stack of medical journals. On the narrow kitchen counter were 2 pieces of toast, untouched and cold. The whole place smelled faintly of soap, coffee, and rain from a coat drying by the door. There were no photographs on the walls. That hurt him more than he expected. Marianne sank onto the edge of a chair. How bad was he? Thin, hurt, paw damage, infection near the shoulder, marks around his neck. Graham watched her face tighten with each word. "He's healing." "Thank God," she whispered. He did not know what to do with her relief. Part of him wanted to hand it back. Part of him wanted to let it stand. "I found Millstone House," he said. Her eyes closed. There it was. Not surprise. Recognition. Graham felt the old heat rise in him, but he kept his voice low. "You knew." Marianne opened her eyes again. They were blue-gray, washed tired by fluorescent hospital nights and years of holding herself together in rooms where other people fell apart. "I knew Silas brought him back once," she said. "Maybe twice." "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked toward the window. Outside, the afternoon snow had softened the parking lot into a blurred white field. "Because I was ashamed." That's not an answer. It's the only true one I have. The silence after that was not empty. It was crowded with old things. Graham stood near the kitchen counter because sitting felt too much like forgiveness and too much like surrender. Marianne folded her hands together in her lap, then unfolded them, then pressed one thumb into the other palm, the way she used to when she was trying not to cry in front of patients' families. "Silas came to the door one winter evening," she said. "You were gone. Contract work, I think, or maybe the treatment program. I don't remember which absence that one was." The words were not cruel, but they landed sharply. He had Bracken with him, said he found him near Millstone Road with a cut paw. He'd taken him to Tessa, had it cleaned, then brought him home because of the tag. "And you never called me." "I thought I would." Marianne swallowed. "Then I thought about what you would hear. Not that Bracken had wandered, not that Silas helped. You would hear that I had failed to keep him safe." Graham almost answered. Then he remembered the way he had reacted to broken things in those years. The tight jaw, the silence, the way he made disappointment feel like weather moving into the house. Marianne continued, quieter now. The second time, Silas didn't make a big deal of it, just said, "This old boy knows where soup is." He tried to make me laugh. Her mouth trembled. I didn't. Graham looked down. A woman could live in the same house as a man and still become afraid of what his silence would do to her. He had never raised a hand to Marianne. He had never called her cruel names. He had never thought of himself as a dangerous husband. But there were other ways to make a room hard to breathe in. "I should have told you," she said. "I know that." "Yes?" Graham answered. She flinched but nodded. "Yes?" That was the terrible mercy of the conversation. No one was innocent enough to be clean. He turned toward the window, watching snow collect on the railing outside. "The night he ran," he said, "June told me there were fireworks." Marianne's face changed. "That night," she said, and the two words were enough to make the room colder. Graham waited. "I had just come off a double shift," she said. "A patient died that morning. His wife kept asking me if he had suffered. I drove home in snow and the house was dark, and Bracken was already pacing because people out past the ridge were setting things off." She pressed both hands flat against her knees. "He started howling after the third or fourth blast, not barking, howling, scratching the door, hitting the window with his shoulder. I tried your commands, I tried food, I tried sitting with him. He wouldn't stop." Graham's throat tightened. "I called you," she said. He looked back. "I called twice." He remembered seeing the missed calls later in a motel outside Klamath Falls. After a group session he had hated so much, he walked for 2 hours in the cold instead of sleeping. He had told himself he would call in the morning. Morning had brought another appointment, another excuse, another small postponement that had become a blade only now. "I didn't call back," he said. "No." There was no accusation in the word. That made it worse. Marianne's voice grew smaller. "I was crying. Bracken was howling. The whole house felt like it was full of something I couldn't get out. I opened the door because I thought he'd run the yard, settle himself, come back. He had done it before. But he didn't." "No." She looked at him then, and whatever shield she had held between them finally dropped. "I looked the next day. I did. I drove the roads. I called Tessa. I put up a notice at the market." Her voice broke, but she forced it steady. "Then I stopped, Graham. That's the part I hate. Not that I opened the door. That was stupid and tired and wrong, but I can understand the woman who did it. I can't forgive the woman who stopped looking." The apartment seemed too small for the sentence. Graham had entered carrying anger like a stone in his chest. It was still there, but something had cracked through it, and the crack was painful because it let in air. "I wanted to blame you for all of it," he said. Marianne nodded once. "I know. And you deserve some of it." "I know that, too." He looked at her hands. No ring. Then he noticed the thin silver chain at her neck, mostly hidden under the scrub collar. Something small hung from it. A ring, maybe? Or the pine leaf pendant he had bought her years ago in a shop by the river. "I made that house hard to live in," he said. Marianne looked down. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was not the kind of scene people liked because it tied pain into a ribbon. It was only two tired adults standing in the wreckage and, for once, agreeing not to lie about the shape of it. Marianne wiped her face quickly with the heel of her hand. "Can I see him sometime?" Graham did not answer right away. There was a cruel answer available. He felt it waiting. "No, you lost the right." But Bracken had survived because others had given him shelter when Graham could not. If that truth meant anything, it had to begin making him less brutal with his own hurt. "Not yet," he said. Marianne nodded, accepting it. "When he's stronger," Graham added. Her eyes lifted. It was not much, but it was not nothing. That evening, Graham returned to Millstone House. Mara was already there, sitting at the front table, with the notebook open and a pair of reading glasses low on her nose. A small electric lantern cast gold light across the pages. Bracken lay beside her chair, head resting on his paws, as though the house and the dog had resumed an old conversation Graham was only beginning to understand. Mara looked up. "You saw her?" Graham took off his gloves. "Yes?" "And?" He hung his jacket on the back of a chair. "Nobody came out clean." Mara considered that, then nodded. That is usually how truth behaves. They spent the next hour going through Silas's notebooks. Not all the entries were dramatic. Most were ordinary, which made them more convincing. Deliveries of soup, a note that someone needed new bootlaces, a reminder to call Ruth before the first heavy freeze, a line about Hal's dog, Mabel needing cough medicine, a warning that Owen had not been seen for 9 days, followed by another entry. Owen came in. Would not talk, ate 2 bowls of stew, names accumulated, not as a list of charity cases. As a map of people who had once been expected somewhere. Mara had brought a shoebox of loose papers from the library basement, old photographs, thank you notes, receipts for dog food, a hand-drawn winter contact list with phone numbers, addresses, and little stars beside those who had pets. Graham studied it all with the focus he once reserved for terrain maps. "This is more than memories," he said. "It was," Mara replied. "Was?" She leaned back, and there, in the small hesitation before she spoke, Graham sensed another door opening under his feet. "The house is being sold." Bracken lifted his head as if her tone meant something. Graham looked at her. "By who?" "Silas had no children. The property passed to a cousin's son, Arthur Vance, lives in Idaho. He's been paying taxes on a house he never wanted, and now a winter resort developer has made an offer." Graham stared at the notebook between them. "How soon?" "Soon enough that I stopped sleeping well." Mara tried to smile and failed. "Which at my age is rude. Sleep is already a rare visitor." "Can he sell it?" "Legally? Yes." She folded her glasses. "Morally? That depends on who you ask, and law is rarely interested in being asked second." Graham stood and walked toward the mantel. The photographs watched him from their dusty frames. Silas in his battered jacket, Bracken in the red scarf, people with tired eyes holding mugs, dogs at their feet, a whole quiet country of need gathered in one room. "Who is Arthur Vance?" Graham asked. 64, retired insurance adjuster, I believe. His wife has serious medical bills. He is not a villain, if that is what you are hoping." "I wasn't hoping." Mara gave him a look over the rims of her glasses. Graham exhaled. "All right, maybe I was." "It would make things easier," she said. "Unfortunately, most troubles are caused by people with reasons." The next day, Tessa joined them at Millstone House after closing the clinic. She arrived with a thermos, 2 folders, and the expression of a woman already annoyed by whatever legal complications awaited. She wore a dark flannel under a quilted vest, and her medical bag hung from one shoulder. Bracken greeted her with cautious dignity until she produced a biscuit, at which point dignity negotiated terms. Tessa reviewed the old receipts, the contact lists, and the notebooks. "This could matter," she said. "Not emotionally. Emotionally, it all matters. I mean practically. If you can prove community use, maybe you can delay demolition or qualify for some kind of non-profit lease arrangement." Graham looked at her. "You know how to do that?" "No, but I know how to call people who pretend they do." Mara's mouth twitched. Tessa turned a page. You'll need inspection, insurance, a plan, money, volunteers, legal permission, and probably 3 officials who enjoy making simple things spiritual trials. So, nothing hard. Exactly. Bracken lay beside the notebook, his muzzle on the open page where his own name had been written in Silas's hand. Graham looked at him. It was absurd, perhaps, to imagine a dog understood property law, taxes, health insurance, zoning, and grief. Bracken understood none of those things. Yet he understood the house. He understood safe windows, warm floors, hands that did not grab, doors that opened during storms. That was enough. Graham touched the page gently, careful not to disturb the dog's nose. For most of his life, when something was threatened, he had known the shape of the response. Secure the perimeter, identify the danger, move toward it. But this threat was paper and debt and a man in Idaho with a sick wife. No enemy, no clean line, only a promise dissolving in legal ink. By late afternoon, Mara spread out the remaining papers on the table. Tessa began marking what might help. Graham sorted names into 3 piles: found, unknown, deceased. He hated the 3rd pile. He hated the unknown pile more. At the bottom of the shoebox, Mara found a folded red scarf. Old wool, frayed at one end. Washed so many times the color had softened from bright red to something deeper, like ember under ash. Bracken rose before anyone called him. He walked to Mara, sniffed the scarf once, and sat down. The room fell quiet. Mara held it out to Graham. "Silas kept it," she said. After Bracken stopped coming for a while, he said it should wait here in case the dog ever needed to remember the way. Graham took the scarf. The wool felt light in his hands, far too light for the weight it carried. He knelt and tied it loosely around Bracken's neck, careful of the healing skin beneath the fur. Bracken stood still. Then, slowly, he leaned his head into Graham's chest. Not the desperate collapse from the church, not the exhausted surrender of the first night in the cabin. This was different. A quiet acceptance. As though Graham had not claimed the scarf but agreed to share what it meant. Mara looked away and removed her glasses to clean them. Tessa pretended to reorganize papers. Graham rested one hand against Bracken's shoulder and looked around the room. The circle of chairs, the old mugs, the notebook full of names, the snow pressing gently against the windows. He had thought Bracken brought him here to explain the past. Now he understood the crueler truth. Bracken had brought him to something still unfinished. A house could die, Graham realized, even while standing upright. Not from fire, not from storm, from neglect, from paperwork, from everyone assuming someone else would remember. He looked at Mara. "Give me Arthur Vance's number." Mara did not smile, but her eyes changed. Tessa capped her pen. "Before you call, try not to sound like you're planning to invade Idaho." "I'll work on that." Bracken, wearing the faded red scarf, rested his head on Silas's notebook. Graham looked down at the names beneath him. Hal, Ruth, Owen, Mabel, Bracken. People and dogs who had once found a place before the storm got worse. Outside, evening lowered over Millstone Road, turning the snow blue. Inside, Graham felt the shape of his anger change again. It was no longer aimed only at Mary Ann, or himself, or the winter that had nearly taken Bracken. It had become something steadier, less useful for blame, and more dangerous to despair. Responsibility. Bracken had not led him here to admire a memory. He had led him to a promise that was about to be erased from the earth. And Graham, who had spent so long believing he had nothing left to protect except one wounded dog, understood at last that love had widened the perimeter without asking his permission. Graham Hollis began by fixing the roof. It was not noble work in the way men like to imagine noble things. There were no speeches, no flags, no swelling music rolling over the snowy ridge. There was only a leaking seam above the west room, 2 cracked shingles, one rusted gutter, and a ladder that looked old enough to have opinions. Cal Riddick loaned him the tools after pretending not to care. "Bring back the nail gun," Cal said, standing in the repair yard with his arms folded over his insulated coveralls. "Not because I trust you, because that thing has more personality than most people who work here." Graham lifted the toolbox into his truck. "I'll treat it with respect." "Don't. It hates weakness." By noon, Graham was on the roof of Millstone House, boots planted wide, cold wind pulling at his jacket. Below him, Bracken lay on the porch, wearing the faded red scarf, eyes half closed but ears awake. The dog had been improving steadily, though the limp still returned when the air grew sharp. Graham had learned not to hate the limp. Tessa's words had stayed with him. A limp was not failure. It was a record. Mara Keene arrived first, carrying 3 file boxes from the library and a bag of coffee grounds. She moved carefully over the packed snow, burgundy hat bright against the white slope, her old key ring chiming at her wrist like a small iron choir. "You look uncomfortable up there," she called. "I'm fine." That is what men say shortly before becoming paperwork. Graham looked down at her. "You and Tessa share a training manual?" "No, we were born knowing." The work changed the house before the house changed anyone. Graham patched the roof, rehung a shutter, repaired the porch railing where the wood had softened. Cal sent over a space heater and 3 extension cords with a note that read, "Do not burn down the community dream palace." Tessa brought donated dog food, flea medication, bandages, and a folding exam table that had 1 uneven leg and an attitude. Mara sorted Silas's records into piles on the front table: photographs, receipts, contact lists, handwritten notes, old thank you cards. The house still looked worn, but it no longer looked surrendered. Deputy Miles Rourke arrived on the 4th day. He came in uniform, brown winter jacket zipped to the throat, sheriff's patch dark against the sleeve, boots clean despite the snow. Miles was 46, broad-shouldered but not bulky, with close-cut sandy hair and a square, practical face that looked built for bad weather and parking disputes. He had been the deputy who once told Graham, with as much kindness as a lawman could risk, that a dog missing in winter might not come home. Now he stood in the doorway of Millstone House, looking at the sagging ceiling, the old stove, the extension cords, and Graham holding a hammer. "I'm trying very hard not to say several discouraging things," Miles said. Graham set the hammer down. "Appreciate the effort." Miles stepped inside and scanned the room the way some men scan for threats and others scan for violations. He saw both. "You can't just open this place to people." "We're not open." "You have coffee on?" "Mara says that's not legally binding." From the kitchen, Mara called, "Coffee predates law." Miles rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I'm not against what you're trying to do, but if someone slips on that porch, freezes because the heater fails, or gets trapped in here during a storm, good intentions won't keep anyone out of court." Graham felt irritation rise, old and ready. Then Bracken stood. The German shepherd walked slowly to Miles and stopped in front of him. He did not wag. He did not beg. He simply looked up, scarf frayed at the edges, torn ear bent slightly forward, amber eyes steady. Miles looked down. Something in his face shifted, just enough. "That him?" he asked. "That's him." Miles crouched, not too fast, and offered the back of his hand. Bracken sniffed it, considered him, then allowed one careful touch between the ears. The deputy exhaled. "Well," he muttered, "that complicates my ability to be strictly unpleasant." He spent the next hour walking the house with Graham, pointing out hazards, fire extinguisher, exit signs, cleared walkway, first aid kit, no sleeping overnight without inspection, no open flame unattended, No extension cords under rugs. No pretending old wiring was charming. Graham listened, jaw tight at first, then more carefully. This was a different battlefield. Miles was not blocking the road. He was marking the mines. By the end, the deputy took Silas's old notebook from Mara and read several entries near the fireplace. The longer he read, the less official his face became. "My uncle's name is in here," he said quietly. Mara looked up. Miles tapped the page. "Ray Rourke. I thought he spent his last winters alone." Mara's voice softened. "Not all of them." The room changed around that sentence. Miles closed the notebook with more care than he had opened it. "I can help you with a temporary community use checklist," he said. "No promises beyond that." Graham nodded. "That's enough." "It won't feel like enough." "I'm learning that." People began returning after that, though none of them admitted they were returning. Harold Hal Bixby appeared on a bright, windy afternoon in an RV that sounded like it had been assembled during a thunderstorm. He parked crookedly near the drive and climbed out wearing a navy knit cap, an oil-stained brown work jacket, and boots tied with 2 different laces. At his side came Mabel, an elderly mixed-breed dog with a white muzzle, cloudy eyes, and the slow dignity of a retired queen. Hal squinted up at the house. "I came to see if the SEAL knows the difference between a hammer and a soup ladle." Graham, halfway through securing a loose porch board, looked at him. "Depends what needs fixing." Hal barked a laugh, then coughed for longer than the laugh deserved. He was 67, thin under his layers, with big mechanic's hands that trembled when he thought no one was watching. He filled the room with words the moment he entered, as if silence were a dog that might bite him. Mabel went straight to Bracken. The 2 dogs sniffed each other with solemn ceremony, then lay down near the stove as though continuing an old professional meeting. Hal saw them and stopped talking. For nearly a full minute, he only stood there. Then he cleared his throat too loudly. "Well, at least one of us remembers how to behave in public." Ruth Calder came the next day with waffles wrapped in dish towels. She was 58, sturdy, sharp-eyed, and dressed in a dark green coat dusted with flour at the cuffs. Her husband had been one of Silas's regulars, though Ruth described it as dropping by now and then, the same way a lighthouse might describe guiding ships as occasionally blinking. "I made too many," she said, setting the warm bundle on the table. Mara lifted an eyebrow. "For a woman who lives alone? I have ambitious batter." Nobody challenged this. There were lies told to deceive, and lies told so dignity could keep its coat on. Ruth walked through the house touching things lightly. The back of a chair, the edge of the mantel, 1 chipped blue mug. She did not cry. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and began cleaning the kitchen with the fury of a woman declaring war on dust. Owen Vale arrived during snow. No truck sound. No greeting. Graham only noticed him because Bracken lifted his head toward the door. A man stood on the porch in a faded black field jacket and a gray beanie pulled low. He was in his mid-50s, lean to the point of looking hollow, with dark eyes that avoided landing on any face for too long. One hand remained in his pocket, turning something small over and over. A lighter, Graham guessed from the faint metallic click. Mara saw him and went still. "Owen," she said softly. He looked past her into the room, not at the people, at the exits, at the windows, at the stove. "Silas here?" The question entered the room like a bird hitting glass. Mara removed her glasses. "No," she said. "He's been gone a while now." Owen's face did not move, but his hand stopped clicking the lighter. For a moment, Graham expected him to leave. Bracken rose. He did not hurry. He crossed the floor with his slight limp, stopped several feet from Owen, and sat down. No wagging, no performance. Just presence, offered with the gravity of a sentry taking a post. Owen stared at him. "That Bracken?" Graham nodded. Yes? Owen swallowed once. Silas said he'd come back. No one asked what that meant. No one asked where Owen had been. No one asked why his coat was too thin for the weather or why his hands shook when Ruth offered him coffee. Because no one asked, he came inside. That was how Millstone House began to breathe again. Not all at once, not beautifully. Some days it was chaos with Muggs. Hal argued with Cal over the heating system until both men became personally offended by the laws of electricity. Ruth reorganized the pantry and labeled everything in handwriting so firm it seemed capable of enforcing itself. Tessa set up a pet care corner near the south window and vaccinated 2 dogs before lunch on a Saturday. Mara kept records with the reverence of a monk copying scripture. Graham found himself doing jobs he had never associated with leadership: making coffee, sweeping snow off the steps, listening to Hal tell the same story twice because the second version made him laugh instead of cough, sitting beside Owen for 20 minutes without speaking, calling strangers from Silas's list and saying, "You don't know me, but I found your name in a notebook." Some hung up, some cried, some came. Bracken moved among them like a quiet law, older than language. When Hal laughed too loudly to cover the tremor in his hands, Bracken put his head on the man's knee. When Owen stood abruptly during a crowded afternoon, Bracken walked to the door first and sat there, not blocking him like a guard, but waiting like a choice. Owen stayed. And when Graham lost patience with insurance forms, permits, inspection sheets, and the endless polite cruelty of hold music, Bracken nudged his wrist, then led him to the porch. Outside, the snowfields flashed under pale sun. Graham stood breathing in the cold until the urge to crush the phone passed. "You're getting bossy," he told the dog. Bracken sneezed, unimpressed. The first call with Arthur Vance did not go well. Neither did the second. On the third, Arthur agreed to visit before signing the sale agreement with the resort company. He arrived in a dark SUV on a gray afternoon, parking carefully where the drive had been cleared. Arthur Vance was 64, thick through the middle, neatly dressed in a charcoal parka, brown trousers, and polished winter shoes that looked unprepared for honest mud. His hair was steel gray, combed flat, and he carried a worn leather document case in one hand. His face was not cruel. That bothered Graham. Cruel would have been easier. Arthur looked at the house for a long time before speaking. "My wife says I should listen before deciding." Graham nodded. "Sounds like good advice. She usually gives expensive advice for free." Inside, Mara offered coffee. Arthur declined, then accepted, after Ruth silently placed a mug in his hand as if refusal were a medical condition. They showed him the notebooks, the photographs, the repairs, the temporary safety checklist Miles had started. Tessa explained the idea of weekend pet support hours for veterans and isolated residents. Mara spoke of Silas with restraint, not trying to turn memory into a weapon. Arthur listened, but listening was not surrender. "My cousin should have put this in writing," he said at last. Mara's face tightened. Silas believed a handshake had bones. Banks disagree. Graham felt the room stiffen. Arthur set his mug down. "I'm not trying to insult him, but I've paid taxes on this place for over a year. Insurance is a nightmare. The roof alone—" "I fixed the roof," Graham said. "For now?" Arthur turned to him. "Mr. Hollis, memories don't pay invoices." The sentence struck the room hard. Hal muttered something under his breath. Ruth's eyes sharpened. Owen looked toward the door. Graham felt anger rise, hot and old. Then he saw Arthur glance at his phone. The screen lit with a hospital number. Arthur turned it over quickly, but not before Graham saw the name. Elaine, his wife. The anger did not vanish. It changed shape. Arthur was not a dragon guarding treasure. He was another tired man standing between love and math. Graham forced his hands to open. "What would pay them?" he asked. Arthur looked surprised. "A sale," he said. "Other than that?" Silence. Tessa leaned forward. "A temporary lease could cover taxes while we apply for nonprofit sponsorship." Miles, standing near the fireplace, added, "If they meet safety conditions, I can help them navigate temporary community use approval. Limited hours. No overnight stays." Mara said, "We can gather letters from people Silas helped, documented use matters." Ruth crossed her arms. "The church can host a fundraiser." Hal snorted. "Church waffles are a crime. I'll fix the heater instead." Everyone looked at him. "What?" Hal said. "It offended me." From the corner, Owen spoke for the first time that afternoon. "I have a generator." The room turned. Owen stared at the floor. "Backup diesel. Works. Been sitting in my shed. Silas wanted it here years ago." He clicked his lighter once, then stopped. "Never brought it." No one rushed to praise him. That was wise. Arthur looked around the room, and for the first time his expression became uncertain. Not convinced, but no longer sealed shut. "I'll attend the community hearing," he said, "if you can present a real plan." Graham nodded. "We will." Arthur picked up his document case. At the door, he paused and looked at Bracken, who sat by the south window wearing the red scarf. "That dog yours?" Arthur asked. Graham looked at Bracken, then at the room. "He brought me here," he said. Arthur did not know what to do with that, so he only nodded and stepped back into the snow. The days before the hearing became a storm of work. Mara gathered letters. Tessa wrote a proposal. Miles corrected half of it in red ink and called the other half idealistic but not criminal. Ruth spoke to the church. Hal attacked the heater with tools and insults. Owen delivered the generator in the back of an old pickup, then disappeared for 2 hours when everyone thanked him too directly. Graham worked until his shoulders ached and his hands cracked from cold. Late on the final evening, the others left one by one. The house settled into quiet. Not the dead quiet from before. A resting quiet. The repaired stove hummed softly. Papers lay stacked on the table. The chairs were still mismatched, but now each had been wiped clean. Outside the south window, snow fell through moonlight, bright as scattered ash from some heavenly fire. Graham sat on the floor near the hearth because the chairs were all covered in folders. Bracken lowered himself beside him with a sigh, pressing his shoulder against Graham's leg. "You know," Graham said softly, "I thought this was about keeping you." Bracken closed his eyes. Graham looked around the room, at Silas's notebook, at the red scarf, at the repaired railing, the labeled pantry, the generator paperwork, the list of names still waiting for calls. "But you were never something to keep, were you?" The dog breathed slowly. Graham rested his hand on Bracken's back, feeling the warmth beneath scarred fur. He had spent so long trying to get back to the life he had lost that he had nearly missed the one opening in front of him. He was still divorced, still uncertain, still a man with nights inside him that did not always end when morning came. But the house had light again, and for now that was enough work for one heart. Outside, the snow kept falling over Millstone Road. Inside, Graham sat with the dog who had come back wounded and led him to a wider kind of loyalty. He was not only trying to bring Bracken home anymore, he was learning how to keep a lamp burning for those who had forgotten the way. The community hearing was held in Ben's town hall on a pale Saturday morning while snow drifted softly against the windows. It was not the sort of room where miracles usually happened. The chairs were metal. The lights hummed. The coffee in the back tasted like someone had described coffee to water from a distance. A long table stood at the front, where 3 council members sorted papers, adjusted microphones, and tried to look prepared for whatever weather people brought in with them. And people had brought weather. They came with folders, invoices, memories, doubts, pride, and dogs lying under their chairs. Hal Bixby sat near the aisle with Mabel curled against his boots, wearing a navy knit cap pulled low and the suspicious expression of a man who believed all microphones were government traps. Ruth Calder had brought a covered basket, despite being told food was not necessary. Tessa Monroe sat with a thick folder on her lap, tapping a pen against it in a rhythm that suggested she was ready to argue with God if God mishandled the paperwork. Mara Keene sat straight-backed beside her, Silas's notebook resting in both hands. Deputy Miles Rourke stood near the side wall, not officially part of the case, but too involved now to pretend otherwise. Owen Vale sat in the back corner where he could see both exits. Graham noticed that first and understood it without judgment. Bracken lay beside Graham's chair, the faded red scarf loose around his neck. His torn left ear tilted whenever the room grew too loud. Every few minutes, someone glanced at him, some with recognition, some with curiosity, some with the careful softness people gave to animals who had survived more than they could explain. Arthur Vance sat at the front. He looked tired, not hard, not greedy. Tired. His charcoal parka was folded neatly over his knees, and his worn leather document case rested by his shoes. Twice before the meeting began, his phone lit up. Twice he checked it quickly, then placed it face down again. Graham saw the hospital number once more and looked away. It was easier to hate a man before one knew what he was afraid of losing. The hearing began with procedure, property designation, temporary use request, liability concerns, tax burden, maintenance obligations. The council chair, a woman with silver hair and patient eyes, explained that no one was deciding the fate of every veteran in Oregon that morning. They were deciding whether an old private property could be granted a 6-month limited community use lease while a formal nonprofit partnership was explored. Hal muttered, "She makes hope sound like a plumbing permit." Ruth elbowed him. Arthur spoke first. He did not attack anyone. That, too, made things harder. He stood with one hand resting lightly on the table and explained that Millstone House had passed to him through family after Silas Mercer's death. He explained the unpaid taxes, the insurance concerns, the structural risks, the offer from the winter resort developer. He did not mention his wife until one council member asked whether there was financial urgency. Arthur's mouth tightened. "My wife has medical expenses," he said. "Significant ones. I am not trying to erase anyone's history. I'm trying not to drown in bills attached to a house I never asked to inherit." The room went quiet. Graham felt Bracken shift beside him. Arthur looked toward the crowd then, and for the first time his voice lost its prepared edge. "I understand this house mattered to people. I do. But meaning does not repair wiring. Sentiment does not pay insurance. And if someone gets hurt there, memories will not protect them." No one had an easy answer. That was the weight of adulthood, Graham thought. Sometimes truth arrived wearing the wrong man's coat. Mara spoke next. She did not plead. She did not dramatize Silas into a saint. She simply opened the notebook and read. Dates, names, weather warnings, deliveries of soup and dog food, calls made before storms, notes about people who had not answered their phones. A reminder to check on Ray Rourke after the freeze. A line about Bracken waiting at the south window until the snow eased. When she finished, she looked at the council. "Silas Mercer did not build a program," Mara said. "He kept a door unlocked in winter. That sounds small until you meet the people who had nowhere else to knock." Miles lowered his gaze. Tessa stood after her and did what Tessa did best, turned compassion into logistics. She spoke about aging veterans with service animals or companion dogs, about people who could afford medicine for themselves or food for the animal, but not always both. She explained that Bracken House would not be a shelter, clinic, or overnight facility. It would be a limited weekend warming room and pet support station with posted hours, volunteer staffing, safety rules, donated supplies, and basic checkups by appointment. Kindness without structure burns out, Tessa said. Structure without kindness becomes a waiting room. We are trying for something better than both. Hal leaned toward Ruth. That was annoyingly good, Ruth whispered. Try learning from it. Miles confirmed the safety checklist. Temporary signage, clear exits, fire extinguishers, no overnight stays, inspections before opening, limited occupancy. He sounded official until he reached the last page and paused. My Uncle Ray was on Silas's list, he said. He looked toward the council, then toward Arthur. My family thought he spent his last winters alone. Turns out he didn't. I can't ignore what that means just because the paperwork came late. The room shifted again. Then Hal stood. Graham had not expected it. Neither had Hal, apparently, because he looked faintly offended by his own legs. He shuffled to the microphone with Mabel watching him like a disappointed supervisor. My name's Harold Bixby, he began. Nobody calls me Harold unless I owe them money. A small laugh passed through the room. Hal scratched his beard. Silas once fixed my heater with baling wire, a spoon, and language not suitable for this dignified facility. The laugh grew. He called me a stubborn Navy fossil. I told him at least the Navy understands boats, unlike whatever land-based nonsense he belonged to. Hal stopped smiling. That heater kept me and Mabel alive through a 3-day freeze. The room became still. Hal looked down at his hands. I don't like needing people, he said. Most of us don't. We get real artistic about pretending we're fine. Silas let us pretend. Then he helped anyway. His voice broke on the last word. He coughed roughly, turned away from the microphone, and wiped his face so fast one might have mistaken it for irritation. Mabel rose under his chair and wagged once. It was almost enough to undo Graham. Then his own name was called. He stood slowly. He had not worn a uniform. He had not brought medals. Under his charcoal coat, the olive-drab combat shirt was visible at the collar and sleeves, faded and practical, marked by use rather than ceremony. Dog hair clung to one side of the coat. He had noticed it before leaving the cabin and left it there. Bracken rose with him. Graham touched the dog's head once, then walked to the microphone. For a moment, he saw only faces, doubtful faces, hopeful ones, tired ones. People who wanted a good ending but did not want to pay too much for it. People who had loved someone difficult. People who had been difficult. People who knew winter was not only a season. Graham gripped the sides of the podium. When I came back to Bend, he said, I thought I had lost my wife and my dog. His voice sounded rougher than he expected, but it held. I was right, but I was also wrong. No one moved. I thought Bracken belonged to me because I loved him. Then I found out he had been saved by people I never knew to thank. Silas Mercer, Mara Keene. Some of you, people who left food, opened a door, kept a fire going, or simply sat in a chair long enough for someone else not to be alone. He looked toward Arthur. I'm not asking anyone here to pretend bills don't exist. They do. I'm not asking Mr. Vance to carry a burden that should have belonged to a community long before today. Arthur's eyes lifted. I'm asking for 6 months, Graham said. Not a miracle, not a monument. 6 months to prove that a warm room, a pot of coffee, a safe place for a dog to lie down, and a list of names can be part of how a town survives winter. He paused. Bracken stood near the front row, still as a carved guardian. I spent a long time thinking strength meant not needing a door opened for me. Bracken knew better. He found one. I'm here because my dog had the wisdom to go where people were still kind. A quiet sound moved through the room. Not applause. Something deeper and more fragile. The council chair thanked him. Graham stepped back, and Bracken leaned against his leg before he reached his seat. Then the back door opened. Mary Ann entered quietly. She did not make a scene. She did not look around as if seeking forgiveness from a room that had not lived their life. She wore a navy winter coat over her scrubs, hair tied low, face pale from work and courage. In her arms, she carried a small cardboard box. Graham's chest tightened. Tessa saw her first and stood. "Mary Ann?" Mary Ann nodded once. "I have something," she said. The counsel allowed her to come forward. She did not speak long. She did not defend herself. She did not confess for sympathy. She opened the box and removed 3 things. An old photograph of Bracken wearing Silas's red scarf on the porch of Millstone House, a receipt from Juniper Paw Clinic paid by Silas Mercer, and a short handwritten note Silas had left with her after returning Bracken years earlier. Her voice trembled only once. "This house helped Bracken when Graham and I couldn't," she said. "That doesn't make our mistakes smaller, but it makes the house real." She looked at Graham, then away. "I thought I was the only person failing in that house," she added softly. "I wasn't. I just didn't know there was somewhere people went when failing became too heavy." The room held the words gently. Graham did not move toward her, not yet, but he did not look away. That was something. The council recessed for 20 minutes. People stood, stretched, murmured. Arthur stepped into the hall to take a call from the hospital. When he returned, his face was drawn, but not shattered. He sat alone for a moment, staring at his hands. Graham approached him. "You don't have to be the villain in this," Graham said. Arthur gave a tired laugh. "That's supposed to comfort me?" "No, just seemed worth saying." Arthur looked toward the front of the room, where Mara and Tessa were reviewing papers, where Hal was feeding Mabel a forbidden piece of waffle, where Bracken stood beside Mary Ann while she carefully let him sniff her hand. The dog did not rush to her, but he did not turn away. Arthur watched that for a long time. "My wife told me this morning," he said, "that if I sold the house without listening, she'd haunt me while still alive." "She sounds efficient." "She is." For the first time, Arthur almost smiled. When the council returned, the decision was not a victory carved in marble. It was smaller, 6 months, a low-cost lease, mandatory repairs, proof of insurance, limited hours, monthly safety review, no overnight stays, a public report before any extension. Or Arthur retained ownership while giving the group time to form a non-profit partnership or raise funds toward purchase. It was fragile, conditional, imperfect. The room applauded anyway, not because everything was solved, because the door had not been closed. 3 weeks later, the sign went up. Hal carved it from reclaimed cedar, and the letters leaned slightly upward at the end, as if the sentence itself had begun climbing a hill. Bracken House come in before the storm gets worse. Ruth claimed the crookedness gave it character. Tessa claimed it gave her a headache. Mara said Silas would have approved because he had always distrusted anything too straight. Owen said nothing, but he hung it level, mostly. Opening day arrived under a bright winter sky. Snow lay clean across the valley, and sunlight turned the drifts silver blue. Millstone House did not look new. The porch still sagged a little. The paint still peeled. The chairs still failed to match. But smoke rose from the chimney, coffee warmed in the kitchen, and a stack of dog blankets waited near the south window. Tessa checked the joints of an old hound while its owner pretended not to worry. Mara arranged Silas's books on a shelf marked, "Take one, bring it back if the story helps." Ruth set waffles on the table and dared anyone to mention she had made too many. Hal stood near the heater, listening to it with the pride of a man who had personally negotiated with fire. Owen fed wood into the stove, quiet as a shadow that had decided, for the day, not to disappear. Graham stood on the porch with Bracken. The red scarf moved lightly in the wind. A car pulled up below the drive. Marianne stepped out carrying a small metal bowl. Graham knew it before she reached him. Bracken's old food bowl. She held it with both hands, as if it were breakable. "I kept it," she said. "I figured. I didn't know how to throw it away." Graham nodded. For a while, they stood side by side, looking at the valley. No vows returned, no easy repair, no old life waiting behind them, polished and ready to resume. There was only the clean ache of two people who had hurt each other and still wished, in some buried room of the heart, that the other might one day be warm. Marianne looked down at Bracken. "Hi, old man," she whispered. Bracken sniffed her hand, then pressed his nose briefly against the bowl. Marianne closed her eyes. Graham took the bowl from her. "Thank you." She nodded, unable to answer. Then the first visitors came up the snowy path. An older veteran with a small trembling dog tucked inside his coat. A woman carrying a bag of knitted hats. A middle-aged man who kept his eyes down and stopped twice before reaching the porch. Bracken stood. He walked forward before Graham did, slow but sure, scarf bright against his black and gold coat. He approached the man with the lowered eyes and sat a few feet away. Not demanding. Not performing. Waiting? The man looked at the dog, then at the open door. Graham stepped aside and pulled it wider. Warm air spilled onto the porch, carrying the smell of coffee, wood smoke, waffles, old books, and dogs. "Come in," Graham said. The man hesitated. Behind him, snow glittered on the road like a field of tiny broken mirrors. Inside, someone laughed softly. A chair scraped. Mabel sneezed. Hal accused the heater of showing off. The man crossed the threshold, then another, and another. Graham looked down at Bracken, who had returned to his side. "You did good," he said. Bracken leaned against his leg. The house filled slowly, not with triumph, with warmth, and that was the truer miracle. Graham did not get his old life back. He did not return to the cedar house with the blue door and pretend no one had broken. He did not become less haunted because a room full of people needed coffee. Marianne did not become his wife again simply because she had carried a bowl through the snow. But love had changed shape. It was no longer something to grip in fear. It moved hand to hand now, from Silas to Mara, from Mara to Graham, from Marianne's trembling fingers to Bracken's old bowl, from a wounded dog to a man at the door who had almost turned back. Outside, the winter brightened over Bend. Inside Bracken House, the fire kept its small, stubborn kingdom. And Graham Hollis, who had once thought home was the place where nothing was lost, finally understood that sometimes home was the place brave enough to welcome what had been. Sometimes healing does not look like getting the old life back. Sometimes it looks like finding the courage to open a new door, even while your heart is still carrying the weight of what was lost. Graham thought Bracken had come home so he could be saved. But in the end, Bracken led him to a place where many wounded souls could be welcomed, remembered, and warmed again. Maybe grace works that way in our own lives too. Quietly, through a loyal dog, an unfinished promise, or one small act of kindness that keeps someone from facing the storm alone. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments what Bracken House meant to you. And if you believe stories of loyalty, healing, and second chances still matter, please subscribe and stay with us for the next one. May God bring peace to your home, warmth to your heart, and a lighted door when you need it most.